Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to our webinar today. The topic is Modernizing the Brand Growth Blueprint Through Technology. And we have two amazing speakers. And so we'll talk about really how brands can leverage technology to achieve brand growth. I'm Marie Berry from Chinatown Bureau, and I'll be moderating this talk. And I have John Dubois from O360 and Paul Miser from Chinatown Bureau. So I'll hand it over to you guys for a quick intro, starting with John.
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome, thanks. So I'm CEO and co-founder of O360, and we founded O360 with the premise that consumers are already telling brands and retailers what it is they want and need, and that we just need to do a better job of listening, interpreting, and even understanding what they're saying. And as the consumer engagement has exploded over the last decade, we're finding maybe that's harder to do on a one-to-one standpoint with human power. So to that end, we built an AI platform that leverages machine learning and natural language processing and other technology to deliver actionable consumer and product insights that are derived from these public consumer engaged comments. So our platform currently is used to provide insights for researchers and agencies to better understand what consumers want. So I'm excited to get into how AI for consumer understanding has become a catalyst for brand growth.
Great, welcome. So an AI-powered insights company, and now Paul, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining and thanks for having me. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Chinatown Bureau. We're a digital product studio and consultancy focused really on brand growth. We were founded under the premise that advertising or brands are more than just advertising, and brands are now becoming platforms. So we work with our clients to really figure out what those holistic consumer strategies are, and implement different digital products and strategies to start to actually fulfill those strategies. We believe that there's more than just communicating the brand promise, but it's actually fulfilling the brand promise is what the new kind of modern brand growth playbook needs to be. So really excited to be here, and we've worked with John and O360 a few times over the past couple of years, so it's good to reconnect and be here. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome. Great. So we will talk about the problem that we tackle, which is really that we live in a world where consumers demand consistent and personalized brand experience, and companies have a hard time to catch up with that. So I'm excited to hear your point of views on the current landscape and what companies can do. For everyone who's on the line, please, if you have any questions, feel free to send them to our Twitter handle. And we can answer at the end of the webinar. There's the hashtag brand growth. This will help us to see what type of questions you have. There's also the opportunity to just ask a question in this chat directly. Okay, so let's just dive in with question one, which is, and you mentioned it already, the fact that the ad future is moving into a platform business. And we see a lot more companies that are really betting on platforms and digital products. We saw AT&T, for example, they said the future state of the ad business is a platform business. Now, Paul, coming from the advertising industry, and now having your own product studio, I'm curious to hear what your point of view is on that, and what's creating this shift and what some of the implications are.
Yeah, and I think, like I mentioned, platforms are huge right now. But I think it's a completely profound statement, and I think it really shows that we're entering this new normal of business and this new normal of branding. And I think the ad business as a platform is really in direct reflection of what's happening in the industry, both with consumer behaviors and both of how brands need to respond to those consumer behaviors. So I think ultimately all brands themselves are going to become platforms. not only from how they have to communicate to their consumers, something that has to be consistent, it has to be connected, it has to evolve over time on the front end, but then also on the back end, there's all of the systems and processes that have to be in place to make sure that those conversations can happen. And I think that that's something that shows that we're truly in a different world than we were maybe 5 to 10 years ago. And I think, the statement kind of really makes me think of kind of 3 things that we need to consider as we kind of talk about modernizing the brand growth playbook. The first thing I think is consumer demand. We've seen over the past 5 to 10 years, consumers went from being talked to from a mass advertising standpoint to actually leading the conversation with brands and actually wanting more, requiring more, and actually interacting with brands and aligning with the brands that they stand for from a values perspective. And I think that's just tremendously huge. Not only that, but then also there's so much more option and choice for consumers right now. There's so many different channels that they can purchase, they can interact, they can service, and many different companies and insurgent brands are coming up and actually offering more and more service for consumers. So I think that's the number one. Second is, I think, the idea of a platform really shifts the perception of how we have to communicate and how we have to engage with our consumers. The world of advertising and campaign mentality is over. So in the past, if you wanted to sell 1 million more toothbrushes, you created a great ad campaign, you put an incentive on the toothbrushes at shelf, and that was what pushed product. But today's day and age, consumers want more than just a product and a service, and they're looking for that experience. So it's really figuring out what is that holistic life cycle for the consumer, and then what is their lifetime impact on the business, and how do you actually start to maintain that relationship over time. And then with those 2 things, there's kind of that third thing that's kind of lurking in the corner, which is technology, which I think that's the thing that's really enabling everything that we've been talking about, and kind of the strategic implementation of technology to actually solve these challenges and solve for those strategies. I think that's ultimately what's creating the platform, and that's what's creating that shift.
Great. John, what's your point of view having a digital platform as your business? I assume that you have a similarly positive answer to this, but still curious to hear what you think the implications are and what's really creating that shift.
I think in general, as humans, we have a need to connect, and these communal platforms, they've basically consumed our attention and our engagement. And it's really interesting to see these platforms that have really offered the idea that I can get on and connect with people I haven't seen in 20 years, or that I can start a group around a certain topic and collect people with similar interests. That those same platforms are also some of the best platforms to target from a programmatic standpoint. So I think, this idea of a platform sort of breaks down that idea, the old idea of sort of the supply chain, if you will, where, a brand wants to communicate with a consumer, and therefore they need to go through a supplier or a broker or an agency to establish the media relationships and obviously the programmatic relationships, and ultimately figure out how to reach the right consumers. I think what we're seeing these days with the platforms is that the same tools that consumers are using to engage, brands and marketers are able to use to engage with those consumers. And I think that's a pretty profound shift. I would liken it to sort of the idea that, where there's market friction, you generally have a platform to ease that friction. And if we think about retail merchants, 25 years ago even, to get your product on a shelf, that was the primary way to introduce your product to market, was tricky, right? And even 20 years ago, or eBay is introduced and gives smaller vendors and individuals a way to get products to large base of consumers. And now with sites like Amazon and Walmart, we're seeing these third-party marketplaces become platforms for retailers to do the same thing. And ultimately, we're seeing a lot of smaller organizations provide products and innovation that we hadn't seen before. So I think we're seeing the same thing in social platforms as consumers share and engage, and the brands are making their experience more authentic and direct and maybe less unidirectional. And I think AI is kind of at the core of doing this at scale. So yeah, I think platforms play an important role there.
So speaking of AI, we're talking about platforms, and I think it was explained well how you were saying it's now like digitizing the supply chain and making everything frictionless. But going even beyond that, now you mentioned AI and you know, talking about the role of AI with platforms and the power it might have. So if you could talk a little bit about that, as well as maybe some of the risks that would be interesting.
Yeah, I think, you know, as with any sort of cultural signal, you know, ideas and consumers change, and the ability for us to stay on top of these significant cultural changes and stay relevant is important. So, you know, how consumer insights and a public conversation can be interpreted for those consumer insights. I think building these consumer-driven models where machines are learning, they're learning to navigate, you know, either reactions or cultural implications and learn over time to become more accurate, I think is one of the keys. And obviously doing this at scale, you know, where you have millions of consumers that you're trying to engage with, like trying to build the one-to-one message with human effort would be, you know, quite daunting. So I think, you know, the ability for a machine to understand consumers based on their behaviors and their beliefs and the things they share online has become pretty important and profound. I think like anything else, there are trade-offs, right? So the first is to do this with AI for consumer benefit, Marie, is I think the key, because ultimately the trade-off is privacy, right? So I heard a speaker once mention that when AI is used as a butler versus a stalker, it does have a profound impact, and it becomes less creepy, obviously. So when I think about 20 years ago, if you had asked me, will I share my location with you every day of, you know, every minute of the day, I would have said, no way, that's, you know, that's private. But these days there's a benefit to sharing my location with my phone provider, because I can get the quickest route to my next meeting, or I can understand where my loved ones might be stuck in traffic, or that sort of thing. So I think Google's CEO said it best, that AI is probably the biggest innovation since fire and electricity. And I think his point was that we, like fire and electricity, we need to understand the risks as we harness the power of AI to make our lives better. So.
Very well said. Yeah, I mean, personally, also believing in technology and the power of it, I think there's like this progress where it's exciting to be part of shaping it. But as you said, like privacy governance is one thing that I think everyone who works in the tech world really needs to have an eye on. So then talking about, you know, the different types of platforms that there are. And so it seems like lines are blurred between consumer platforms or platforms that talk to consumers like YouTube, Amazon, and you name it. And then all the other digital platforms that are more invisible for the consumer that help internal workflows. So let it be to manage your digital assets or automate your marketing. What are those like differences, and what should companies focus on? So maybe Paul, if you can start with that.
Yeah. I mean, I completely think that the lines are blurred, but I think we can't move away from, you know, why we're implementing technology in the first place. I think that especially over my career, I've seen a lot of people ask for the new thing. Like, we need to be on Twitter, we need to have a mobile website, or we need to do all these things, because that was the new technology, not because it was the right thing to do with the business. So I think we have to kind of take a step back and see, you know, technology is a means to an end. It's not the end in and of itself. And so what we have to do as brands and companies is really define, you know, what is that end that we're trying to accomplish, both as a brand and what we're trying to solve for our consumers. And that really helps us start to identify what that tech stack needs to look like. If we know what that relationship, the ideal relationship looks like and all the nuances, then we can start to actually apply technology to that. So I do think that there are two types of tech, like we mentioned earlier, and like you just mentioned, there's technology for operations sake, which kind of drives efficiency, makes sure that data is flowing correctly to the right places to keep the conversation going and relationship going, and all those things that need to happen in John's supply chain to make sure that it's a seamless experience. And then the second is the technology for experience. So what are those things that need to be built that consumers will actually interact with, to make sure that our brand promise is being fulfilled at that moment of interaction, that moment of impact with the consumer. So I don't think you can have one without the other. So I think that, you know, my recommendation for folks listening and other clients is, you know, you need to focus on both. But I think it really needs to come down to what are you trying to solve for? What is the end you're trying to get to? And then figure out strategically and methodically, how do you actually start to build that roadmap in order to get to that relationship. And even going back to the change of perceptions that we need to have from campaign to always on, you know, there used to be an end game in everything that we were trying to solve for in marketing, whether it was more sales or increased loyalty. Now it's almost an impossible game where we have to continue to evolve these relationships. We have to continue to grow, and that impossible game is you know, more successful than what any campaign would ever be, because it's sustainable over time. It grows and learns, and those relationships and that trust is going to be much more beneficial than, you know, an incremental sales on toothbrushes. So.
Okay, so talking about like an always-on machine versus like a campaign-driven like push behind a brand.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree, John? Should there be a focus on one or the other? What should companies think about?
Yeah, I think in my world, in the research world and insights world, I think it's important that these platforms are connected. I mean, I think this type of connection allows for these contextual insights and implementations and faster reaction. You know, I think it's the merging of the consumer-facing and internal AI platforms that bring together the tools and the experiences that enable, you know, higher levels of authenticity, which ultimately is leading to a positive brand experience, right? You having that feeling of one-to-one. So I tend to focus, when I think about this, on the consumer. And I think this goes back to my consulting background is, you know, in general, even for the operational side, the worst thing you can do is expose your departments to your consumer. It should be, you know, it should feel like one voice coming from a customer. And so I think what you have as an enabling on the back end through that, as we're calling it, kind of the supply chain automation piece, and then the interface piece, I think that integration just makes for a much more natural relationship with your consumers.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, John. I think that one of the largest barriers that we're seeing with you know, some of our larger, more traditional organizations is that those legacy systems and those legacy operations are in place based off of your business department. The consumer doesn't necessarily want to see that or need to see that. So the overcoming that obstacle is kind of why that perception shift needs to change to more of that impossible game, and actually getting into that roadmap to make sure how do we start to build a single relationship with the consumer, not a bifurcated and siloed relationship. So I agree with you.
So talking about the fact that there's like these digital platforms that will help consumers and also workflows. Now we see, and we talked about the shift in like doing marketing and doing like advertising. Recently, we saw even the large holding companies moving towards platforms. So we saw in the news a couple of weeks ago, Omnicom announced their platform called Omni. Like earlier this year, Publicis was launching Marcel, which is an AI tool, and all those are supposed to help to automate the workflows of all their employees. What do you think about that? Like now, like, do you think it's more than just a PR campaign? I'm skeptical, but I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Maybe Paul.
Yeah. I think the idea of it is really great because I think that there is a lot of waste in large organizations, especially knowing the background in large holding companies. There's just a lot of waste that can be automated. So I like the idea of leaning on technology to automate those processes and those systems that free up the human time so that the humans can do what they do best, which is creativity, empathy, strategy. I think the future is there in order to implement something like an AI assistant throughout a massive organization. But I agree with you. I'm pretty skeptical in why at what moment that they've communicated these as tools across an entire holding company. To implement something at that scale is a huge challenge right now. And there's a lot of legacy business processes and a lot of P&Ls that have to be broken in order for that to become something that's actually truly helpful within an organization. I like the grit of it, but I think right now it probably is more of a PR play. And I think that's probably a lesson for people who are trying to implement stuff like this and think about stuff like this of how do you overcome that challenge of traditional business operations, traditional insights, and actually start to create a strategy and leverage technology in the way it needs to be leveraged.
Cool. Great. So, John, I don't know what your thoughts, also having worked with large brands, advertising, like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think a couple of points here. I think one is, if you think about the startup market in general, startups, the top percentage of startups that make it are essentially qualified by their ability to succeed with customers. And so they're, by that, they're probably doing something innovative that is of interest, right? And so what we're seeing right now in marketing AI is you're seeing a lot of consolidation. You're seeing a lot of these large shops are actually acquiring techniques and technology and platforms. And I think that's being driven from a few things. One is customers are asking for AI, whether, to Paul's point earlier, whether or not they know what that really means, or if they're themselves just checking a box like they used to do with, I need a social media presence or I need a website, is unsure. But the other, I think, pressure that this market is feeling is from the consultancies. I mean, who would have thought, 10 years ago or 15 years ago that Accenture and Deloitte and some of these other consulting firms would be building meaningful digital practices that are actually, stealing some of the share around these from the agencies. And so I think the advantage they have maybe that they think about a problem from a business objective standpoint first, and bring to it the creative and the brand level thinking. But it's an interesting space, right? And so I guess in some ways, I think startups will bring the innovation, and we're seeing a lot of pressures from consultancies, and one other, which is a lot of brands are starting to bring agency work in-house and moving towards a direct-to-consumer model. And so I think those things are forcing agencies to look at innovation, look at technology, as well as customer pressure.
Right. Yeah, definitely. It will be an exciting time to watch as these lines are blurred between agency, consultancy, startup world, in-house. So all powered through technology.
Oh, 360.
Thank you.
Speaking of, yeah, I would now, after having like talked about the landscape, would love to move over to your current businesses, the efforts. If you could give some examples of what you've been working on, maybe Paul, if you want to start.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as a digital product studio and consultancy, that's really what we're focused on is how do we start to transform our client brands into platforms so that they either become more efficient or more effective in how they're interacting with and communicating with their consumers. So we do that very pretty much every day on the consulting side of the business, but on the product studio is something that's really interesting with our background in the advertising space. We see there's been a lot of efficiencies in terms of brand management, marketing management that we feel could be automated. So we've got a 5-year roadmap that is starting to solve for some of those pain points through technology. And we're building proprietary software to empower both brands and agencies to become a little bit more efficient in that process. Our first product, which is about ready to hit the market, is really focused around brand governance and brand compliance, where it's almost an X-ray for marketing material. So if you have a whole bunch of marketing collateral that needs to be approved and make sure that it's on brand, it's compliant, it's legally vetted, we've actually taken brand guidelines and brand rules, turned them into code, so that an engine, machine learning, can go in and scan those marketing collateral and see where those differences are. So it's really interesting to see kind of how that's starting to get a little bit of traction with some folks, and really looking to see how do we actually take that review process down from 3 weeks to 4 months down to days. So I think that's something that we're really, really excited about.
Awesome. Yeah. A code-based solution for brand guidelines.
Yeah.
Awesome. John, what have been some of the current efforts that O360 did?
Yeah, sure. So, you got EDC was saying that in 2017, there were 20 trillion gigabytes of data created by humans, which is insane. And that number is increasing doubling almost every 2 years. So, we've been focused on learning how to harness that, the consumer generated portion of that data for brand advantage. So a couple of areas. One, if you can imagine a set of tools that highlight where your message is most likely to resonate with your desired audience, and even identify topics that perhaps your audience has shown interest in, but isn't covered in your content implementation or part of your strategy. Or one where machines learn about the interests and habits of your cohorts or microsegments, and alert you of where they prefer to engage or around what topics, making your conversations with them less intrusive. And maybe even one area where I'm tracking kind of emotive and perceptive changes in a brand's attributes based on your engagement or products or services in market, and how the consumers are engaging with those offerings. I mean, these are the types of tools that our platform, or types of solutions that our platform brings to market.
Right. And I also know that you guys have worked together on a few projects. So I'd love to hear how that was, what the approach was, and really how you leverage technology in this process.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure working with John over the past couple of years. So,
amazing.
Yeah, great. So we've done a tremendous amount of things together in terms of innovative marketing and innovative targeting and everything like that. But I think that the one that was really exciting was our recent project together, where we have a large multinational pharmaceutical client that was looking to go out and actually run an ad campaign. So, which they haven't done at a large level in many years. So the idea of really understanding who they're talking to, why they're talking to them, and what's going to drive behavior and what's going to drive action was something that they were really interested in. So we, with that as a challenge, we knew that we needed some really interesting insights. So we called John and O360 and really started to figure out, what's really happening in the marketplace around the pharmaceutical industry. And what we identified, the challenge was really to understand, what are the personas, what are the audiences that we're actually going to talk about. So it was almost a clean slate. There were some inputs, but we used pretty much a clean slate to go out, start to understand what is actually happening in the marketplace, who's talking about what are their behaviors, what are they connected to, and kind of what are their interests. And with that, we were able to, I'll let John talk about the details, but we were able to pull out a lot of very interesting insights that made the personas not only come to life, but it also gave a lot of texture around them to really help to not only drive messaging, but drive media plan as well. So with that, John, you can go into the details and talk about bits and bytes.
Sure. I'll get into the texture. I like that. Sure. Yeah, we used for this effort, we used our consumer portraits offering, and so the premise of that is that we can identify key segment influencers. In this case, scientific influencers, or more specifically, pharma influences. And the idea is, rather than studying the influencer, we study the audience of the influencer. And so what we're able to do is build a portrait of the consumer that's being influenced or that's engaged at a high level with someone like Bill Maher, the science guy, for example. And so what we are able to get from that is, based on their public engagement, we were able to get psychographics and demographics and values and needs, attitudes and interests, and essentially using machine learning and using NLP and other techniques, really get to what is the core of this audience. Like, what are the statistically significant attributes of a person in one of these key segments that are being influenced by these influencers. And we were able to convert this into what I'll call living personas, if it were. So these are the idea that, again, with cultural changes, these things may also change, but being able to identify those and have machines identify these key sort of features of a consumer based on what it is that it's watching, reading, and understanding, I think were key to that offering. So it was a lot of fun. I mean, as always, Paul likes to throw the challenging stuff at us, and I love it when we hit home runs. So
it was fun.
And it's interesting you're saying, like, while we talk about technology, the user remains at the core. And I hear that coming through from both of you. Now, coupled though with the technology and AI, like, the interesting thing is that you don't just get the insights from a few, like a focus group, for example, or like a panel that is online. Now with AI, you can actually then make predictions. So that's an interesting way how to scale those insights. But I'm curious, like, how big can we go? Like, how good are those predictions? Like, how can we scale it really while keeping the quality of the research?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'll take a stab at that, Paul. I think core to this is the modeling of AI to learn like a human being learns, and there are a couple of core elements that help humans learn different ideas. So one is communicatively through speech or through nonverbal communication. Another is conceptually. So in our mind, we understand that a glowing red metal is hot. We understand that without having to communicate it. It's a concept that we picked up through life. And the last is experientially. So even if I've never touched that glowing red thing, if I've seen something else that had a very similar thing, I can learn from the experience that thing will be hot. And so we're able to do, with today's portfolio of AI components, we're able to teach machines in very similar ways, which allows those predictions to be pretty good. The nice thing about AI, however, is that we can do this at large scales. So, this gives companies the power to better target and also to predict how consumer groups will be affected by different brands in certain markets and certain areas. So we can go into a macro view, but also you can get really microscopic as well with as we were talking about earlier, with specific features of the consumer. We often use our audience affinity prediction score to determine which brands have the best shot at gaining attention in different media events, or helping retailers understand which products may get better tracking on end caps in stores, and that sort of thing. So I would say that AI is doing a very good job at both fine-grained and coarse-grained sort of predictions. But I think the core to that is having an AI platform that actually does learn and does use multiple techniques and not just rely on one. So.
Yeah, I think that's completely important, and I think as we're talking to very large, established traditional organizations, their problem with brand growth is almost twofold. One is we have to sell more of the products that we have now, and two is we have to innovate in a category that we don't know yet. So I think the use of insights and AI will help us, start to understand where is that white space that we can actually start to innovate in, so that we're not only kind of growing what is keeping the lights on, but how are we getting ahead of the curve of the consumer and getting there before these insurgent brands that are finding those white spaces, kind of along the way as well. So I think that the right use of AI and that type of information is not only powerful for increasing what we have now, but finding what we need to do tomorrow.
Great point. Yeah, good point.
Because really the AI is only as good as the data input, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, at this point, I think, to your point, John, like finding first what's that initial data set that you start with, and then, hopefully making predictions based on that data. Cool. So we're almost at the end of our webinar. If anyone has any questions, please send them to our Twitter handles at Chinatown Bureau or at Oculus 360, or our personal handles, #brand growth. So after this last question, we'll go through one or two audience questions. So now we've heard a lot about the different types of platforms. When it comes to selecting your tech stack, what should a company focus on? So how can companies build and manage their technology? This is as a final question, if any advice that companies should consider.
Yeah. I think, as we've mentioned throughout this conversation, is that, technology is a means to an end, not an end in of itself. So I think the first thing that we need to really look at is what are we trying to accomplish with our audience? And so you really have to understand, what the audience is all about, what they're doing, what they're consuming, how they're behaving, understand what's happening in the industry, and then kind of get a bigger view of what those trends will ultimately become using AI. So I think once we kind of understand that, we'll understand how do we as a brand, or how do we as a business respond to that with our current offerings of service and products, but then where else can we be playing? And so using those two things, mapping out the user journey of how that comes to life, we can start to establish what are the technologies that we need to have and what data components need to be established. So I think, to say that, Amazon is the only platform that a CPG company needs to be on is probably wrong advice, but understanding what is that relationship that a CPG company needs to do in a world of Amazon. So I think it's really vetting all the technologies that you have at your disposal and figuring out which ones actually help you achieve your goal and help your consumer relationship become a little bit better.
Cool. Don, what do you think companies should consider?
Yeah, I think I think there's an interesting synergy between this idea of consumer insights and tech enablement, and I like to describe the new blueprint for engagement using terms that one of my colleagues, Tom Edwards, often mentions, which is multimodal, and the idea that the new interface driven by AI is about understanding context and understanding the consumer in context and providing them with a more natural way of continuing to engage with brands, whether that's through voice or touch or continually through visual and things like augmented reality and other tools. So I like to think that as brands continue to innovate around the experience, they're doing it in mind with how consumers want to be engaged, with, and what's the most natural. I mean, there's a reason that infants will touch a magazine as if it's an iPad. There's an intuitiveness to it. There's a reason that it's so easy to ask, your Alexa or Siri a question rather than get up, walk across the room and pick up your phone. There's a reason these things have, have evolved to the point where they are now, and we'll continue to see that evolution.
So speaking of how to select your tech stack, we have a question from someone asking about small companies. So a lot of the things we talked about are probably only possible in large corporations where you can think about, all the internal platforms to automate workflows, but also then what are the platforms and efforts you should do for consumers. Now, it's really interesting. The question is really what can a small company do? So short answer from both of you, if there was one thing, what would it be? Starting with John.
I would say, I used to say listen to your customer, but I would say not only listen, but try to understand your consumer base. And that's, there are tools, there are low-hanging fruit tools, whether it's, Google's survey, capabilities or AI tools like our platform. There are plenty of ways that you can get a better understanding of your consumers.
Yeah, I think that's the number one, is understand your consumers. But I think, we are talking about huge enterprises, but in today's day and age, there's so many other different types of technologies you can establish. So I think once you understand who your consumer is, my one thing would be go where they're at and talk to them how they want to be talked to, and through your brand voice. Anybody is able to go onto Twitter for free and talk to their consumers, but without knowing what they want and who they are, it's kind of meaningless. So I think I would build off John. I would say you do two things: do what John said, and then go talk to them in your authentic brand way.
Awesome, great. So we've learned a lot today about how brands can leverage technology. I'm excited to continue the conversation with the two of you. I see there's one more question. How would your solutions compare to mature platform like Mention or similar listening tools? So John, I guess that's a question for you.
Yeah, so I think Forrester and Gartner are onto something when they say that this idea of listening to the consumer is evolving into understanding the consumer. And I think a lot of the listening tools to date have been built around sort of campaign-based. So I put a message in market and I'm trying to understand the reaction. Where we differ is we try to study historical and up-to-date conversations and predict what is your best shot at having a message that makes sense to a given cohort. We have a number of models that study industries. So things like in social listening, there are issues around things like ambiguity. One of the examples I use often is, if I'm talking about automobiles, or I'm talking about fashion and I say, I use this to go out, then we all understand the context. If I then shift and I'm now talking about refrigerators and I say my refrigerator is going out, we as humans know that doesn't mean the same thing. There's a disambiguity problem. I mean, that needs to be solved, and our ambiguity problem that needs to be solved with disambiguity. And so our tool actually builds domain models so that we can solve a lot of those problems. And you know, we've been in market now since 2014, and so you know, we've sort of perfected the use of multi-layer of deep learning to get to that understanding.
Yeah. Great. So if there's any other questions, we are, you can ask us on our socials at Chinatown Bureau or at Oculus 360. Also after this webinar, we're always happy to have that dialogue and keep the conversation going. So thanks so much. I feel like the three key takeaways from this were really like what we talked about in the beginning, the shift of like going from just messaging the brand promise to fulfilling it. So that shift of the perception of how to achieve brand growth. The second is really how to build an appropriate tech stack. And we heard about the mix of internal and consumer-facing platforms. And then the third core takeaway was really the always-on optimization. So you both said like it's really important to have that machine always running, so continuously listening, testing, iterating. Great. So we're at the end of our time. So thanks very much, and yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you.